the colonists are aiming at empire in the sense of trying to achieve independence against Great Britain. And in the second instance, they're aiming to create their own empire across Eastern North America, one that's founded upon slavery and dispossession.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this is Colloquy, bringing knowledge from the university's PhD community to top-of-mind issues. I'm Paul Massari. Here in eastern Massachusetts, where I've spent almost all my life, you can't take more than a few steps without tripping over a marker or a monument to the American Revolution. In school, you take field trips where it all happened: the Boston Massacre, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill. My middle school teachers presented the Revolution as the struggle of humble farmers and merchants to free themselves from the clutches of the British Empire. You'll be hearing a lot of that this 250th anniversary year. But the historian Brian DeLay says that the great paradox of the Revolution was that the Patriots were fighting not only for their independence, but also for an empire of their own, one that rolled through the lands of indigenous peoples west of the 1763 boundary set by the British at the end of the 7 Years' War. Moreover, DeLay says that the war was one of a spate of revolutions that spread across the Americas over a 50-year period in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The common thread throughout these conflicts, and the determinant of success and failure, was often access to guns and ammunition. Here to talk about this lens through which to understand the American revolutions is Brian DeLay, a professor and the Preston Hotchkiss Chair in the History of the United States at the University of California Berkeley. A historian of North America who works at the intersection of U.S., indigenous, and Latin American histories, DeLay's forthcoming book, Aim at Empire: American Revolutions, Arms Trading, and the Birth of U.S. Empire, 1763 to 1815, reframes the Revolutionary era as a half-century struggle among imperialists, insurgents, enslaved people, and indigenous polities over the power conveyed by guns and ammunition. A Lillian Gale Knoeffel Fellow this year at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, Brian DeLay received his PhD in history from Harvard Griffin GSAS in 2004. Brian DeLay, welcome to Colloquy.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So before we explore the history of the struggle for arms in America, I want to talk about an even more fundamental framing that's right in the title of your forthcoming book, Aim at Empire. As I mentioned in the intro, we tend to think of the revolution that birthed the United States as the Patriots' struggle for independence from the British Empire. So how was it simultaneously a war for empire as well?
I think all revolutions are twinned stories. It's a story about an exit and a story about an entrance. It's a story about exiting a political arrangement that no longer serves a people's interests and the creation of something new that hopefully will. It can be difficult when you're narrating the history of a revolution to be attentive to both of these stories at the same time. In the U.S. case, the venerable way of trying to do this is to pair the exit story out of the British Empire with the story of the creation of a new political structure, from the Articles of Confederation to the drafting and the ratification of the Constitution. And that's a venerable, true, very important story, but it's also a story about interactions between white people. Right. So it's a story in the first instance about interactions between colonists and the empire, and in the second instance between citizens of the new emerging republic as they try to figure out their political future. The problem with that framing is that it obscures how totally fundamental an imperial project was to the revolutionary project writ large. And what I mean by that is that the revolution was launched, fought, and then elaborated upon after the war was over with Great Britain, in large part to secure two kinds of imperial goals. The first was control over hundreds of thousands of war captives, essentially, enslaved people of African descent who constituted about a fifth of the population of the United States at the time of the Revolution. And the second was to obtain land and resources from the indigenous people that controlled most of the Trans-Appalachian West. These were not minor sideshows that some white Americans were involved in. They were integral to the entire political project. And so the reason that I've called the book Aim at Empire is to try to capture that double story in the exit and the entrance, right? The first is that the colonists are aiming at empire in the sense of trying to achieve independence against Great Britain. And in the second instance, they're aiming to create their own empire across Eastern North America, one that's founded upon slavery and dispossession.
So, you've identified in your response right there these two, you call them in the book, legacy wars, that Europe and the colonists had been prosecuting really since the late 15th century. Talk about how that framing then led you to want to explore the era of the American revolutions. And again, we're talking about revolutions really throughout North and South America. Explore those through the struggle for guns and ammunition. What does it allow us to understand that other kinds of frameworks don't?
So there's really, I guess, three things that I find appealing and interesting about building a revolutionary history around guns and ammunition. The first, just very practically, almost no other historians have done this. There's massive scholarship on the age of revolutions, just enormous amounts of brilliant work for generations. But very interestingly, almost nothing or virtually nothing on in any sustained way on how all of these contending parties equip themselves in order to advance their own interests against armed opposition. So the novelty of it is one of the appeals. The second and more substantial reason I think that this is a useful lens is that we're very accustomed to building revolutionary histories around things like ideas, discourse, ideology, even culture. These approaches have been enormously productive and have reshaped our understanding of the period. It's also true that those kinds of approaches exclude some actors and include others, right? That in a way that guns and ammunition cut across these divisions. So whether you were literate or not literate, whether you spoke English or Cherokee or Haitian Creole or Spanish, whether you were a Republican or a monarchist, whether you were a slaveholder or an enslaved person, it didn't matter, what your connection was in any of those realms. If what you're really trying to do is to find the capacity to advance your own vision of freedom in a way that guns and ammunition would allow you to do, right? So the basic materiality of these things cuts across these divisions, and I think makes it more possible for us to see the wider tableau of actors involved in the revolutionary story. The third and final reason that I have found this to be such a, for me at least, really interesting lens onto the revolutionary era is that almost no one in the story, except for the Europeans, had the capacity to mass produce these things. That meant that everybody, again, whether we're talking about George Washington in the Continental Congress, or we're talking about an enslaved person in Virginia, or we're talking about the Shawnees, or an insurgent movement in San Domingue, everybody had to find a way to tap into the international arms market. And that fact introduces so much uncertainty and contingency into the story. The guns are moving in ways that almost no one can completely control. Obviously, some people have lots more power over than others, but all kinds of unpredictable things happen. And as a historian, we all love contingency. We all love being able to point out moments where things could have turned out differently. And I think when we focus on guns and ammunition and the way they snake through these stories, the moments of contingency are so easy to see, and they're so pregnant with possibility that for me, it kind of took a story that I had felt maybe overly familiar with and made it newly strange and exciting to me. So I hope readers are going to feel the same way.
I want to expand our lens to some of the other American revolutions. But before I do that, I do want to ask a follow-up based on what you've just been saying. You were talking about the need for access to mass production of weapons, and that really only the Europeans have access to that. And then your book begins with this really fascinating story of someone discovering, this antique rifle that was made in Springfield, which, eventually became this huge center for arms production, rifle production in the United States, gun production. I'd love it if you could talk about the British obviously had such an advantage there. How were the Patriots, if we're going to call them that, how did they get access to the kinds of arms that they needed to effectively oppose essentially the largest empire in the world?
If you're looking at facing organized military resistance to what it is you want to accomplish, you need weapons in quantity. And there's three basic ways you can do it. Going from sort of least reliable to the most secure. The least reliable way to do it is to rely on foreign patronage. You are useful to some other foreign power that has the capacity to mass produce and deliver these items to you, and they'll do it as long as you continue to be useful to them. That's one way. The intermediate way, the way that gives the weapon seeker a little bit more power, is through the market. If you have things that you can sell in sufficient quantity and you have access to these international market outlets, then maybe you'll be able to buy what you need on the open market, right? That's the second mode. The third and the most secure mode, the mode that everybody most wants to be able to do, is just make it all yourself. And at the beginning of the story, again, no one in the Americas can do that. They all have to rely on some mix of foreign patronage and market access. So when the American Revolution begins, there's all kinds of informed observers that are scratching their heads and saying, this is the most insane thing I've ever seen. Because, again, as you say, these farmers are going to go up against the mightiest empire that's ever existed in the world. They have absolutely no chance. They don't even have an arms industry. How are they going to do this? But there were really insightful figures in the American Revolution who today, for weird reasons, their reputations have been minimized and they're not very well known, they were merchants and they had an understanding of these kind of international networks, and they had this really brilliant insight, which is that alone among colonial regions in the Americas, British North Americans were uniquely positioned to overcome these problems precisely because they have so long belonged to the mightiest empire in the world. That membership had conferred real distinct advantages upon them. So, for example, they had an enormous merchant marine, and that was a consequence of belonging to the British Empire. And that merchant marine not only gave them the infrastructure to manage the transportation problem with all of these materials, but it also gave them all kinds of market connections to other places around the world that otherwise they wouldn't have enjoyed, that they immediately began to operationalize in order to buy arms and ammunition, like as early as late 1774. They have, again, a number of connections that they wouldn't have otherwise had to merchant houses and financial centers of financial power in continental Europe. They mobilize all these things in the first 2 years of the war through this astonishingly effective play into the international arms market. And it's far more successful than any of their enemies believed that it would be. And even many of their proponents were shocked at how successful it was. But by late 1776, the British Empire had figured out how to really fatally disrupt this market through all kinds of different strategies, mainly through the exertion of the British naval power. And so by the end of 1776, early 1777, it's looking extremely grim for the North American insurgency. And then in early 1777, these giant ships began to arrive straight from France, absolutely packed to the gills with guns and ammunition. And that's the savior of the entire project. So it's foreign patronage that makes the revolution a viable, ongoing movement. And then, of course, it's the decision of France and Spain to formally enter the war on behalf of American independence, indirectly for Spain, but directly for France, that contributes their navies to the cause, that turns it into a global war and transforms the whole conflict. So it's, one way to think about the United States is that it's neither uniquely bad nor uniquely good, but it is arguably uniquely lucky. And the American Revolution, time and again, that is borne out.
So let's now expand our lens a little bit to revolutions where the actors didn't necessarily have the benefit of being part of the British Empire for so long. You talk about two in particular. I'd love it if you could unpack them a little bit. What were they, and how did access to guns and ammunition secure the success of one, but the failure of the other?
Great. Well, the American Revolution is the first in a series of geopolitical earthquakes that are going to remake the Americas over the course of the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. And I'm interested in that broad hemispheric movement, but for this book, there's just so much going on that I'm focusing really on two other revolutions rather than 20 other revolutions. So the two that I'm focusing on are the Haitian Revolution and the revolution of indigenous people against American imperialism in the Trans-Appalachian West in the 18 teens. So both of these stories are profoundly connected to the American Revolution and the American imperial project, but in really different ways, and in ways that help answer your question about why one succeeds and the other one fails. So for the Haitian Revolution, it should have been a practical impossibility for the enslaved majority in Saint-Domingue, this rich French island colony, to have acquired remotely enough war material to achieve independence from France. That should have been a practical impossibility. They had plenty of courage and self-sacrifice and brilliance, enormous storehouses of those things, and conduit into the international arms trade is not necessary to start a revolution. It's just necessary to win one. So prior to the American Revolution, in other words, what happens in Saint-Domingue, there could have been a massive rebellion. It could have been remarkably important in the history of slavery, but it could not have conceivably resulted in independence had it not been for access to the international market. And that access would not have been possible without the American Revolution. So before the American Revolution, there's no entity anywhere in the Western Hemisphere that is itself a significant arms dealer, because, all the territory in the Western Hemisphere is either controlled by indigenous polities who make no weapons, no gunpowder weapons, or it is under the control of one of several empires. So after American independence, you had something new in the Western Hemisphere, an independent republic that was unencumbered with entangling alliances to European powers. It was deeply committed to the buying and the selling and the exporting of war material. And it was also embarking on some really important steps to create its own arms industry. So that's the case in 1791 when this inspired revolt breaks out in Saint-Domingue. The event that we call the Haitian Revolution is really an incredibly complicated series of wars that layer one atop another, and it goes from 1791 until 1804. But in Saint-Domingue, what we see is sort of the inverse of this story in the United States. In Saint-Domingue, it's imperial patronage that helps the rebellion launch. So almost immediately upon the rebellion getting any momentum, rebels begin acquiring war material from Spain, which is in control of the other half of the island in San Domingo. And then later France shows up and they're involved in an international war, and they begin arming some of these parties as well. And Britain, for its own purposes, arms others. And so there's imperial patronage to a certain extent, and that helps get at critical mass. But by the middle of the 1790s, it's the market that is fueling the Haitian Revolution. And with no close competitor, American merchants are the main vendors who are selling war material to multiple parties on the island, but most especially to the formerly enslaved, who are now in practical control of most of Saint-Domingue. So the Haitian Revolution prevails in the first instance, and most importantly, because of the inspired courage and self-sacrifice of the people that fought that war. But there was also this absolutely indispensable component, which was imported war material, which comes overwhelmingly from merchants in the United States. The third and final revolution, that's kind of the end point of the book, is the revolution that a coalition of indigenous polities west of the Appalachian Mountains fights in order to try to reverse the ascent of U.S. empire east of the Mississippi. Throughout the whole book, there's a discourse in Indian country that says, if we lay aside our old differences and we unite together, we have a chance of stopping this tidal wave. But if we don't, we have no chance. And that is an argument that gets made over and over again from the 1860s all the way up to the 18 teens. The only way that argument really begins to prevail, the only way that it begins to convince people that are on the fence and not so sure that this isn't a road to ruin, is when it is attached to an imperial patron. That's true during the American Revolution, because then Britain is the great patron that's equipping indigenous people to resist settlers. It's true for about a decade after the American Revolution, when both France and Spain, for its own reasons, continue to arm indigenous polities in the face of the challenges presented by this new polity, the United States. And then it becomes true again starting around 1812, when Britain and the United States go to war. And so inspired indigenous leaders, including Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, use that moment to revive this pan-Indian resistance project, anti-imperial project, and they're relying completely on imperial patronage in order to equip their project. And I said a little while ago that was it's an inevitable way that actors in the Western Hemisphere try to arm themselves, but it's the least reliable way because, of course, it's a faucet that the patron can turn on and off. And so not only are you vulnerable to the possibility that the patron will simply decide it's no longer in their interest to do this for you, but you're also vulnerable to their wisdom and their strategy and their ability to manage logistics and all kinds of other problems that don't cut in the interests of indigenous militants in the War of 1812. And so they find themselves fighting poorly equipped against a country that's just absolutely awash in weapons, because by 1812, the United States had succeeded in creating either a third or a second-tier arms industry, where almost all of the weapons that its army and its militia are using against the combined forces of the British Army and these indigenous warrior societies, they're almost all American-made. And that's just not something that was going to be enough. And so the kind of coda in some ways to the book is that Great Britain had continually abandoned its indigenous allies through this sequence of wars in North America. And that the Treaty of Ghent, these negotiations that are convened to end this latest war between Britain and the United States, the British negotiators come in and they say, okay, well, one of our non-negotiable demands is we insist on a protectorate state for our indigenous allies. That would have been an enormously consequential development in the history of North America. And the American negotiators say, that's a complete deal breaker. And the British say, okay, never mind, we don't insist. And so that's the end of any question about who is going to be in control of Eastern North America. And after 1815, it's clearly the United States.
You know, you were just telling the story of how the people in Haiti, the Black population of Haiti, were able to get independence from the French colonialists through their access to guns and ammunition. It's one of the astonishing things about reading your book, or at least the portion you sent to me, was that notion that they were getting their arms from American arms dealers. How then, when they do achieve independence, how does that have an impact on politics in the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it raises this significant paradox, which is that the United States, not all white people in the United States, even in the late 18th century, were enthusiastic about slavery, but that was nonetheless a system that the United States committed itself to in its Constitution, and it was only growing, rapidly by then. So the United States is committed to slavery at this point, and it's also very clearly a white man's republic with a certain amount of kind of normalized contempt for people of African descent. So it's interesting that in that context, U.S. traders would provide the war material necessary to create the world's first anti-slavery republic. Now, the reasons that happened, there's a few reasons. One is that I mentioned a moment ago that the Haitian Revolution, we fit a lot under the umbrella of that term. Among other things, of course, this is it is a feature. It's a part of the broader global history of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And the United States finds itself in a different relationship to France over the course of this long struggle. By the end of it, for example, by say 1800 to 1804, there's a really interesting transformation where initially France and Napoleon believe that Jefferson's election to the presidency is going to put them in a commanding position, and that finally they have someone they can work with. I mean, the Adams administration actually, contrary to U.S. law, facilitated the arming of the Haitian Revolution. And Napoleon was confident that Jefferson was not going to do anything like that. And, I forget what the exact number is, something like a quarter of the people that were invited guests to Jefferson's inauguration were French and everything. This is a real French-friendly administration. So there's a lot of enthusiasm initially. And initially, the French minister in the United States comes to speak with Jefferson about what's going on in Saint-Domingue. And he explains, we need to put a stop to this. This isn't in anybody's interest to have these savages, quote unquote, in charge of this important island. And Jefferson gives the strong signal that the United States is prepared to help France reconquer Saint-Domingue. It's going to help them doing that by shutting down the arms trade and by provisioning French troops. Both these things are really kind of preconditions to making this happen. The French minister takes that signal back to Napoleon, and they think, all right, we're ready. And so Napoleon organizes the largest single military operation in the history of the Americas to subdue Saint-Domingue. Ships all of these thousands and thousands of hardened French veterans to go and suppress the Haitian Revolution. But in the interim, what has happened is that the Jefferson administration finally realizes and feels that it has now clear proof that that's stage one in Napoleon's plan. Stage two is Louisiana. Now that's a deal breaker for Jefferson's perspective. And so the administration's opinion about this, it's aversion to Black independence, it's reversion to slave rebellion, all that is trumped by geopolitics and by the knowledge that France cannot prevail in Saint-Domingue because its next step is Louisiana. So they don't do anything meaningful to suppress the arms trade to Saint-Domingue between 1800 and 1803. And they don't provision the French army like they promised they were going to do. And so it's a giant disaster for Napoleon. And that is the reason that Napoleon makes this very grudging decision to sell Louisiana to the United States.
Finally, so there's always the risk of historicizing, particularly in an anniversary year like this year. But how does the fact that the American Revolution was both a war of independence and of imperial conquest continue to shape the country's character today?
People very close to the center of power feel barely constrained to disguise the degree to which they are nostalgic for an earlier America that was explicitly a white man's republic, where everybody else had some subordinate position behind white men. We did have a country like that for a really long time, and it was destroyed in the American Civil War. After the Civil War, we finally had a political framework that made possible the dream of a multiracial democracy. And, white resistance and terrorism stopped that from becoming a practical reality for another century. So, but for my whole lifetime until now, this has been a multiracial democracy. It still is, but it's under attack in a way now that I think few of us really expected 10 or 15. At least I didn't expect 10 or 15 years ago. And so this history becomes deeply relevant. It's hard when it comes to commemoration of these important moments. It's easy, I think, to fall into a situation where we're only focusing on the defects of the early republic and the inequality and the predation of the early republic. And God knows I'm talking a lot about this in the book that I'm writing right now. But we also have to acknowledge that in global context, the American Revolution really was a remarkable advance on a number of different levels, world historic importance when it comes to democracy, to the right to vote, to suffrage, to the destruction of inherited privilege, to the overthrow of the connection between church and state. There's so many really important things that it accomplished that are part of our, heritage in the American Revolution. But we need to have the courage to look with a clear eye at the other sides of the American Revolution in order to understand why we're in for such a fragile moment right now.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this has been Colloquy. This podcast is an extension of the school magazine of the same name. You can find a transcript of the show, as well as past episodes, at the Harvard Griffin GSAS website, gsas.harvard.edu/colloquy-podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please rate the show on Apple or Spotify, or like it on YouTube, so that others can find it as well. And be sure to subscribe to the Harvard Griffin GSAS YouTube channel so you'll never miss a conversation. Our theme music is from the Boston-based band Francine. I'm Paul Massari. See you next time.